Good afternoon, and welcome to the first session of our webinar series, What Will Schools Be Like Next Year? Visioning for the Future of Education, with CEI Director, Executive Director, Dr. Christine Mason, Executive Director of Michigan Elementary and Middle School Principals Association, Paul Liebenow, and Principal of Upper Providence Elementary School, Dr. Melissa Patchke. My name is Dana Asby, and I will be your webinar host. I will let Dr. Mason introduce the webinar.
We're so pleased you can join us today, even as we really hate all these circumstances we're dealing with right now. When Paul and Missy and I wrote the book, Visioning Onward, we had this vision of what schools could be like in the future. And you know, I'm an optimist, so I really thought, wow, what could we do if we really had heart? A lot of our work has been around heart-centered learning and mindfulness and what we can do to help children who most need our support. And now we're in a time where, in fact, science is important. And we can't just be optimistic. We need to temper our optimism with realism. You know, we talk a lot about mindfulness in the work we do. And being mindful means being present here, right now, in the moment. One breath, one step at a time. And so the approach we're going to give you for visioning is one that considers what it means to be really here in the present. Take this as our baseline, as our status quo. And certainly to be optimistic, because, you know, as leaders, optimism is important, but also to make sure that we're being responsible. The three of us feel a tremendous responsibility to go ahead and look at the lay of the land, to go to many sources, and to consider the science, to consider what's happening in other countries, what educational leaders are saying, and to look at all that information. And from that base then, to work with you so that in fact, you have our supports, our research behind you, and hopefully will make your task just a little easier and help you to be a little more accurate in what you predict and where you lead your schools and your districts. And as we consider what's happening and what we're going to do to help you in our own small way right now, I just want to point out that the three of us are working on many levels to try to consider what's best for schools and for education. So I'm working with the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which is a SAMHSA funded project. We have a collaborative for trauma learning that is in New England. We have 24 fellows who work with us, and we keep working with them to try to figure out what can we do to improve resiliency, to improve compassion, and to help all students so that there's a better sense of well-being. Missy and Paul also are working back in their states and nationally. And I'd like to just turn to both of them right now. Missy, maybe we'll start with you. Let's talk for a minute about things you're doing that inform the session today.
Level leaders across our country that are dealing with COVID in different ways and visioning in different ways. I'm also a practitioner. I'm a current elementary school dealing with distance learning, as many of you are in the audience. I have the privilege of working with the PA Principals Association, which is a K-12 organization in Pennsylvania that represents school leaders across our entire state.
And Paul, what about you?
So as a brief introduction, I'm the executive director of the Michigan Elementary and Middle School Principals Association, 39 years in K-12 education. I served as a teacher, a principal and superintendent, roughly 10 years in each spot over the course of the last 32 years before retiring to take the executive director position. I do work in the private sector I own a company called Core Communications, so I do work internationally with that, and work closely still with superintendents as well as school principals, not only in Michigan, but across the United States. COVID-19 has taxed school principals, particularly across the country, with challenges that they never expected or we have never seen in our history. Their courageous and innovative leadership has helped to reduce public anxiety and led to wide-scale daily feeding programs, supporting millions of needy students. They're facing challenges with distance learning, and I'll speak more to that a little bit later, but we're all doing the very best we can. At the same time, we need to be visioning forward, thinking about what the future is going to look like, what that best case scenario could be, and work daily to that end. Chris?
Thank you. I'll just add too that Paul is also the executive director of my association, the Center for Educational Improvement. And Paul and Missy and I have been working together for the last 10 years. So Dana, I think you have a little housekeeping to do now, right?
Yes. So today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. During our microphones will be muted at designated times during the question and answer session. You can use the raise your hand feature to request an open mic. When you're speaking, please be sure to eliminate any background noise. You can also use the chat box feature to ask any questions throughout the presentation. Thanks to a partnership with C4 Innovations, we're offering 1 hour of continuing education credit for participation in this webinar. We can also offer you a certificate of participation. For record-keeping purposes, you must identify yourself while on the meeting platform using first and last name or email address used to register for this event. You can either ensure your name appears as part of your video panel or enter it in the chat box. Registration affirms your consent to receive an evaluation follow-up link via email and your consent to recording. If you experience any technical issues, please send a private chat to Ingrid Paget, our technical support manager for today's webinar. We're pleased you joined the webinar, and I would now like to turn it back over to Dr. Christine Mason.
Okay, so this is our book, and we would encourage you, if you haven't already, to get it because we think it's good. We had fun writing it, I have to say. It was a joy to do the research we did. We give you examples from business, examples from school districts, and examples from history of leadership with visioning. Next slide. So Peter Senge says, learning is driven by vision. What a powerful statement. When we look back over the last 20 years, we know that many times educators have been driven by performance evaluation, by school improvement plans, by goals that have been developed by others, and that oftentimes educators inside school buildings, families, students have not had much participation in deciding what that meant for the school. We believe that was a mistake. So the goals of our sessions, and these are for the 3 sessions, are to problem solve with you about the future of education, to introduce you to our model, our 8 steps of visioning, and to review what you might be able to do if you vision with us over the next 6 weeks.
So one of the things as a school leader that you have to realize is that your visioning, your dreams, your hopes for your school, your students, and your community are always going to be dependent on what's happening in current culture and in the now. And in saying that, all of us, every one of us right now has a new normal. And to a point that term itself has somewhat become a cliche. In my experience, I've had the opportunity to talk to multiple leaders from the central office level to the building leadership to community leaders. And I can truly say that we're at a Maslow level. We're trying to take care of our children. We're trying to make sure that we have our safety needs, our food needs, and our mental health needs cared for. One of the pieces that I've noticed across the country is that the commonality of school leaders is that we're trying to make something that's very broken right now okay. And that's also coming with significant amount of stress and a significant amount of hardship and heart worry. I say that because our physical environment is totally shifted, not just in our schools, but culturally, as we all are dealing with every day. Depending on where you are in the country is possibly the magnitude to which this stress and worry is escalated. We know that we're worried about engagement. We're worried about what comes next. So the infamous, we can't see the forest through the trees. We're planning 5 steps or 5 processes ahead because we can't necessarily see yet where we're going to be in August or September. Are we forever changed? Possibly. Is that a negative? Possibly not. We're definitely in a place where we're rethinking all of our resources and how we communicate, to how we support each other, to how we take care of ourselves. All of you are prioritizing these topics in your own backyard. So I'm going to turn it back to Chris, because we want to know from you, what's your conversation right now? What's happening in your background?
So we have a poll, and we'd ask you to check, and I think, Ingrid, we set this up so you could check all that apply. Let's try that and see if that works. So what are you discussing right now in your schools and districts? I would encourage you over the next few minutes, if you have more to say, to go ahead and use the chat line. There may be something that stands out or something we've missed that you want us to address. So do we have the results yet? Okay, so 76% how to meet the needs of our students and staff right now. Not surprisingly, you know, if you think about schools, usually, right, we're all about what do you do with the emergencies that arise? What do you do day to day to keep things going? So that's happening right now. Missy, do you want to say more?
Yeah, so it's easy to see the right up behind that is all our planning and processing for what's happening in the fall. We're in the what if mode, and we have to be, because we don't know all the answers. We don't know what's going to be dictated us by our communities, by our health organizations, or by our governments. So just like we all strong leaders do, we persevere forward with possibilities. In saying that, that's where visioning is so powerful, because every one of you, aside of this current situation, has a hope and a belief for your community and your school. Keeping that in the forefront, no matter what that means to you in your current culture and where you're leading, is what's going to give those around you strength. When we look at next fall, what we're hearing is resiliency. So if we could move to the next slide. If we're looking at resiliency and the need for our leaders to be flexible and adaptable, and I charge you with considering this not just for those that you're working with, but also for those in your family and yourself. We have to build trust and the capacity to understand, and that's where the emotional intelligence that should always be a part of our conversation as school leaders becomes so critical during any time of crisis. Because without those pieces in place, nothing else will happen well. As we move forward as school leaders during, whether it's this crisis or any other in the future, those that we walk beside and those that we support are looking to us with that confidence and for that vision of hope. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, so if we look at what might happen as schools open back up, you know, what are some of the other leaders saying? Frederick Hess and John Bailey have written something for the American Enterprise Institute. This is a pretty conservative think tank, here in the DC area. And they say some things that are really interesting to me. Some of the things I've seen in other sources, and some of the things, frankly, that I hadn't thought all that much about. You know, I've talked more with principals and teachers and school psychologists, so I have a better understanding of really what's happening right there on the ground level in local communities. But Hess and Bailey also look at the bigger picture and what's happening from a policy perspective in terms of funding protocol. And Paul, I thought maybe you could just take it here and talk a bit.
So I have the privilege of working with our governor's office in Michigan, as well as the Department of Education. We just rolled out a summer learning guidance document that identifies resources and potential funding for continuous learning, for continuity in learning. But as we work with the governor's office and businesses and community members across the state of Michigan, and this is true across the country, we're trying to coordinate our efforts. We're developing protocols for when we do get back to face-to-face. Here in Traverse City, Michigan, this weekend, the governor has opened our area and that of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and we've been on lockdown since March the 14th. The relationship between the schools and community health centers is a daily conversation. Our governors provided regulatory flexibility for all agencies, including everything from pharmacies to court systems and many others. And in terms of trying to provide just-in-time resources and services to those in need. I've been on the phone even today, just today, with two principals who are in the space for non-renewal because of reductions in force, where our state is facing a 25% reduction in revenue. We have essentially been down for the better part of 2.5 months. So this is going to change schedules as we start the consideration of summer school and the fall. We're actually working with a PPE company providing personal protection and trying to identify how we can create spacing between desks for students to come back to school with barriers between desks. Whoever thought we'd have this conversation, but more of that is to come. Chris?
Sure. I might say too, look at this one, rolling closures. So imagine you go through all this work and you open up in the fall and then you get this alert. You know, a student in a classroom or in your school has been exposed to COVID. And as Missy and others have said, you know, a student may have been exposed and be asymptomatic. But then beyond that being asymptomatic, there may be things that start to happen and someone looks at it and says, you know what, it's not safe to stay open. So the planning will need to have some consideration for what to do as those emergencies arise. Another consideration may be just the buildings. You know, is the building configured in such a way that you can do safe distancing? Or is there going to have to be something where we just decide not only that, you know, students may come on alternate days or for half-day sessions, but some students may be our priority students. It's really fascinating when you think about equity and how in the past, many of our most vulnerable students were the last to receive services, and we had to fight for their due process and protection. I hope we don't have to fight for that again, that the students who most need the social supports, those whose parents may be working in vulnerable positions, those who don't have anyone at home to watch over them, are those that we really do our best to account for and provide for within the school systems. And then think about, perhaps some of our parents have done okay with this homeschooling that they're now doing, something they never envisioned they would do. You know, so what is their role going to be? What's the role of the parents going to be next year? Missy, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I would like to. So I go back to that flexibility and adaptability. This is a time for vision to look far beyond the boundaries that we currently work in a brick and mortar setting or in our current systems. For example, everything Chris just identified, and I saw in the chat feature that some of you are making comments about how difficult this situation is for our primary or youngest students. It is a struggle. So the one system measure may not work. There may have to be within even the same school district several choices for parents, because we all know that there's first responders and there's critical care providers and there's grocery store workers and people that are truly keeping our economy going that need to be at work physically every day, and their children deserve to also be and have an education. So it will be interesting how creative our profession can become to serve the needs of all children.
Chris, in total transparency, friends, I'm 63 years old, as well as my wife, 63, both former teachers, and we are schooling our grandchildren. Our son is a single dad, ages 3, 6, and 8. And let me tell you, I have the greatest respect for teachers and principals, the likes of which I've never had in my entire life. God bless you for your work. You're doing amazing things. That said, we have a lack of coherence. What about formative assessment? How are we assessing kids' learning at a distance? And then equity. We have some serious equity gaps, and they're growing every day. Special ed students are not receiving adequate services. But stay tuned in session 2 and 3, because we're going to come with some answers that we're both working on and receiving from different parts of the country.
If I could just say, related to the kids with IEPs, I really thought, as hard as it is to consider that some kids may not be getting all the services they need right now, that our country would have some compassion and understanding that we can't solve all these things overnight. However, I know there are some school districts where already there are lawsuits because kids with disabilities aren't getting their education. And I understand why we want due process, why we want to make sure we do the best we can for all kids. But what this looks like is going to take some creativity and flexibility, adaptability, even as we decide what's most important for each child. And I'll go back to personalized instruction. Okay? And I can remember years ago when we were doing Common Core assessments and looking to see if kids, would meet like 150 different goals and objectives, right? And graduate with all these skills across diverse areas. And we had curriculum pacing guides. And I always wondered, is that really what we want to do to best prepare students for the future? And way back when I was thinking, what I always liked when I was learning was learning about things I cared about. And when I've spoken to many kids over the years and many teachers, sometimes when you pay more attention to the students' interests, you get better engagement, you get a richer discussion, you get students who are more motivated to learn. And so the question I would ask us as we go back and as we think about the future, how can we make sure that we leverage student interests, that we pay attention to student interests, and that their interests help guide what we do, how we instruct, not only for most kids, but for all kids. And that would include our kids with disabilities, the ESL learners, and kids with a wide array of circumstances where they do have different needs. Paul or Missy, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think if you move to the next slide, one of the things that it complements everything that's being said here is the fact that, and I saw again in the chat feature where although we're concerned about our primary students and our special needs students, some of this really is working for some of our children. And this is where we have to take the current situation, as uncomfortable as it can be and as different as it is, and truly start to build collaborative teams to say, what's working? What do we not want to lose during this? How has this created a more equitable flat platform for some of our students? What are we possibly missing? So for example, we have some significant students with emotional needs and mental health needs that we have sadly lost or are very worried about that are out there possibly being re-traumatized right now without the special supports that we have in place in our schools and community. But we also have students that may have never gone through a financial crisis or have their parents, in a very stressed situation, and so their homes aren't normal. So there could be new trauma. These are the pieces that no matter what it looks like when we return to our next school setting, our vision has to drive how we're going to take these new pieces of information and create better systems thanks to everything that we're learning right now. Our children deserve the attention, the SEL, the emotional supports to get through this type of trauma, but they also need their educational platforms to be strong. And in strength, that comes from those Maslow bases, making sure that their needs are met first.
I would say too, looking at the last bullet, reshaping financial structures. Again, let's go to equity and how the richer districts have had it better for a long, long, long time. Here is a chance, if we truly care about kids, that we rethink what we do as states and as a nation, and how we think about what's truly equitable and how we can do the best to do a better job with equity than we've done in the past. Next slide. Okay, so some of you have seen this before. This is our heart-centered learning approach to education. We present this here because this does inform our vision for the future and the vision we're grappling with, I guess, as we look at children's mental health and well-being. It starts with consciousness. There's 5 C's. That's that awareness of what's going on. If we're not aware of how we're feeling, how other people are feeling, what's going on in their lives, what's important to them, then it's really hard to have the compassion that's needed or to go through the rest of the steps to build resiliency and courage. So awareness is important, and there's things you can do to develop a greater sense of awareness. Yoga, meditation, paying attention to your body, self-care are really important. And during this time, when so many of us are overworked, overextended, self-care becomes very, very critical. It's something we tend to neglect. We think we can get to it next week, but I tell you, it'll catch up with you. If you don't take that step back and say, you know what, I've got to build in my exercise. I've got to do those things so that I'm aware of my breath. I'm aware of how I'm feeling and what happens. There's some people that say that during this time, we're more likely to become irritable. That makes sense. We're being constrained in ways we never imagined. So if we're aware of that, we're aware of that for ourselves and others. And it means we may react a little differently, perhaps with a little more compassion for self and others. And when we anticipate that could happen, then we're better prepared to deal with it. And we know how to ease up and not have our normal expectations. And to say, wow, we need to give you a little space here to handle what's going on. So from consciousness comes compassion. With compassion, we learn more about what's truly important, I believe, for ourselves and others. The greatness of our humanity is in our compassion. As we practice compassion in environments and communities that have compassion, people gain confidence. They realize they can handle things. Their self-esteem improves. Confidence is really important. Think about all those new things we're learning, virtual learning, how to do this. And for kids to hear, oh yeah, I did it. You're doing fine is really important. From confidence comes courage. Courage is one of those things that I think has been underrated. We haven't talked much about it in schools. We know it's important, but sometimes we've taken it for granted. People who are out there just doing those courageous things, that's part of what happens. Well, it's something we can build and promote as well by talking about it, by showing it, by lifting up those who are courageous. So as we do this, we are building community. And it's amazing, even at a distance, how we can have community and how important community is, how important that sense of belonging and being connected is for teachers, for administrators, for students, for families. All of these things together lead to more compassionate action and growth. And this is something we've been working with here at the center for 10 years. Missy and Paul have been working with me. And Paul, when you think about this and think about trauma, is there something you'd like to add?
So I do want to point out that all students across this country have now experienced trauma. They've been pulled away from school abruptly. That's created tension in their homes with parents that are trying to work, parents that have been laid off, parents that can't get to unemployment benefits. And so as we support families, we have to be extremely mindful of their circumstances. We're experiencing it firsthand in our house. My wife and I are both full-time workers. In fact, I'm working as many as 12 hours a day now, working with state and federal budgeting. But compassion is so important, but that leads to building of confidence. Confidence in our home is about getting lessons completed, and sometimes in a day, not everything. And then courage to move on to the next thing, plow through, especially where we're having tech problems, plow through to find an answer. And then sharing that information with others that we can help. There's gratification in that. And so one thing leads to another, and a much happier environment for our group. In Michigan, we are having Zoom meetings in 14 different regions of our state with as few as 10 people, as many as 30 or 40 at a time. Administrators looking for support from their peers, encouragement, guidance, and direction, ideas, innovation, ways to fix problems. And that's how we have helped build a community, heart-centered, focused. Chris?
Okay. I'd like to build off of what you said about trauma. You know, some people have asked us recently about screening for trauma. They're really worried about how we're going to do this virtually. And I understand that when you look at things like teen suicides and you think about depression, you want to try to identify those students who are most at risk and in most need of supports. But the reality is everyone is experiencing trauma right now. It's a part of our lives. Some people are more resilient. Some people are better at coping. And some people are doing something that Charles Figley, who was a social scientist who started back in the 80s, he talks about family systems therapy. And what he says is there's dysfunctional coping and functional coping. And I think we need to consider that. You know, there's the things we do to get by that seem to work okay. Some people are better prepared for that coping than others. Some families are better prepared. Some families are more chaotic. They don't have the resources. They don't make the best decisions because they're under stress, and maybe they haven't had good role models or examples. Maybe they don't have the resources. And so we need to be as available as we can be to everyone. However, we really feel that rather than spending a lot of time on identification, we may be better off just to recognize that everyone needs heart-centered learning. You know, it should be in every school, every classroom, and we should consider compassion and conscious awareness and courage and all that for each child and each family. Next slide.
Chris, I think it's important, just to back up for a second, it's important to recognize the distinction between coping, and we had a conversation about this maybe last week, the difference between coping and resiliency. Coping is getting by, getting through, but resiliency is building up enough courage and other resources to plow through to the right solution and get to an end that's satisfying or satisfactory at minimum.
Excellent point, Paul. Excellent. So coping is kind of that intermediate step along the way. What I think that's the way it works for many people. You begin to cope, and as you're coping, you begin to build resiliency because you have those tough situations that you face. And as you face them, you're planning, strategizing, acting. And Misty, do you have something more to add here? Do you look at it a little differently?
So with resiliency, if we're talking about children, the Castle has some great research out there that basically says one of the most key indicators of whether a child can face adversity and come out with a resilient result is that they have at least one person in their life that is unconditional and loves them and supports them. So I want to transfer that to school leadership, and I would say to you, if you need to find your tribe, you need to find the people out there that are going to be unconditional for you and support you. And that might be blood, it might be the people in your household, but it very well could be a trusted coworker or a good friend. This is a time that all of us, as you've heard, are going through trauma. And for you to be on your game as a school leader, you need to make sure not just exercise, but you're taking care and you're ensuring that you're going to get through this with a resilient result.
Okay, we just want to point out we have a couple other resources available to help you. The Mindful School Communities books has about 200 pages of exercises that you could use at various grade levels. You can adapt for various needs. And we give you examples for history, language arts, science. We talk about leaders in the past who've used these and what you might be able to do at different grade levels. So we encourage you to keep this whole mindful perspective in mind as you do your visioning. Next slide.
Okay, so we have talked about a significant amount of impact that we're all working on right now. And many of you that on this webinar are helping, supporting, leading schools or systems or supporting educators. And we need to make sure that we're all prioritizing those heart-centered skills, but also by just simply reframing, providing trusted listening atmospheres, allowing people to feel in your circle emotionally safe, giving people choice, giving them, empowering those around you to share and to talk. All of these pieces coming together and prioritizing relationships will get you through this. When I say you as a system, you as a person, and you as a school, because this is not a time to go maverick or lone wolf. We need each other, and we need to help regulate our own emotions and know when to walk away as well. I saw in the comments that there was somebody in our audience that truly was at the brink of breakdown, and I can tell you that you are not alone. School leaders, we're at the breaking point. I feel like because we're 8 weeks into this, many of us stayed strong, supported everyone else, and now everything is shifting to the what ifs of the upcoming unknowns. And I have seen people personally and have tried to support people personally that are just not handling everything really well inside of their emotions. So I say to you, take the time you need and make sure that you're being realistic and forgiving for yourself as well. I'm going to turn it over to Paul with some of your experiences on this as well.
So what I'm finding is that often administrators and teachers are feeling guilty, responsible for the lack of connection. In Michigan, we have as many as 50% of our students not connected via Wi-Fi or via the net. And I'll speak to a little bit later, but we have lost connection with quite a few students that, and we're surprised by that. In any case, the fact that teachers and principals are feeling responsible, and quite frankly, guilty that they're not staying connected with individual students is really concerning to me. And as I tell them, it's not their responsibility. They can only do what they can do in terms of staying connected. They have to continue to provide a connection in the district that my grandchildren are in. The teachers have a daily 30-minute webinar with them and a variety of other teaching resources. And it's one of the wealthiest districts in the state of Michigan. In other parts of the state, principals are delivering packets to the mailbox and driving as many as 100 miles round trip in the Upper Peninsula, delivering food as well as a packet 2 or 3 times a week. And in some cases, not getting paperwork or assessment materials back to their teacher. And they're feeling horrible about it. And so we need to encourage them to push that off and do the very best that they can. And know that the majority of the population of this country are more grateful than they could ever understand for their efforts.
So I'm going to look for a couple minutes at a couple comments on this page. One is peer support. So it's so important that we do what we can to support each other. Administrator to administrator, administrator to teacher, teacher to teacher, etc. And just remember that you have a role to play and that can help uplift you. And I know it uplifts me. And there are times when I wonder what's going to happen next. And then I have this wonderful sense of community, this virtual community. And it is so touching. It really is. And it is so helpful. And then look at reframing behavior. Think about, one of the stressors that used to be one of the most difficult things for teachers to deal with was student behavior. Now we have some online virtual behaviors that get in the way some, but that's not our primary stressor. And as kids come back, I don't think we'll ever look at discipline through the same lens again. There's got to be more compassion, more understanding for the child who acts out, what that may mean, and how we respond. Missy, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think, Chris, based on what you're saying, if you want to move on to the next slide, I think it leads beautifully into we have to maintain hope, and we have to make sure that we're supporting our kids where they're at, and honestly supporting our staff, our teachers, and our community. And we're at a new place now.
Yeah. And so we're going to open up the mics in a minute. We still have several slides to go through where we want to help you understand what else we're going to do over the next 2 sessions to come. We also have a leader's guide that we're going to distribute after this session. So we want to give you a little bit of the frame for that. But the main message with this slide is we've been talking a lot about all the things we're facing right now, what we're dealing with, and how we have to be mindful of this moment, yet at the same time, dream. And don't let those dreams go away. Don't let go of them. So
Chris, I want to add to that. I had an interesting conversation with a few of my teachers today about what's possible for fall. And one of my teachers very realistically said, Missy, is this one of those conversations where we're going to talk about all that's possible, but we're not going to have the resources or the funding to do these things or the support from an administration? And I thought about it, and I thought that's very true that we might not, but how can we ever see where we want to go or the possibilities ahead if we stop ourselves in this process and don't allow ourselves to dream and hope and imagine what could be? And when you frame it out that way, it really puts visioning in the front line. You can't get there unless you try to, unless you see it. And visioning is part of it's that freedom to see.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so we've been dialoguing a lot. I just invite you to use the chat box. Let us know if you would like to have the mic for a few minutes, or if you have a question. We'll keep proceeding while you go ahead and formulate your thoughts. So, Paul, you've had some corporate experience. And, you know, in our book, we talk about corporations. And one of the things that makes me so thrilled is to see how some of our corporations have really stepped up to the plate and how they're doing what they can to support others right now. What would you say?
Yes, indeed. We've seen a dramatic increase in philanthropy from some of the millionaires and billionaires and multi-billionaires, and we're thankful for that. They've stepped up to provide support with PPE, food, clothing, just simply providing as much financial and HR support as possible. And we are thankful for that. And they're an example of what could be, right? What could be in preparation for the next thing. So COVID-19 isn't the last thing we're going to encounter that's a problem. We're dealing with climate change and the issues related from that. There are lots of things to be concerned about in our future. But I would encourage you all to do two things. Number one, find a board of directors, find that group around you, 2 or 3 or 5 people that you can communicate with, that can help you develop your own vision and for that of your organization. And quite frankly, just the group to vet first and then vent to when you're frustrated. That helps me a lot. I have 1,300 school principals in my queue, and 2,000 people have my cell phone number, and I'm getting text messages 20 and 30 a day with people with concerns. So I have to have my game face on, just like all of you do when you're providing service for those that you serve. But you need a place to vent and find support. That's what all of the leaders in these organizations have done. They have built coping skills first, resiliency, and grit. And the ultimate for me is courage and grit to help get through these really difficult times. It doesn't come easy. It comes with a price. It comes with practice. So I would encourage you to follow the lead. Not all of these leaders representing these companies are stellar, quite frankly. I would suggest that some of them are greedy and they're doing some of the philanthropy for show. But we're going to take it for what it's worth and be thankful it's coming.
I would also say, you know, I'd also say that we're watching the visions of these corporations. We wrote about them in the book, and we're checking every so often to see, are they shifting? What are they saying now about their vision for their companies, as well as their role in the world? And I think there's a lot we can learn by just tuning in and paying attention to businesses, as well as connecting with them.
Exactly. And dream big, folks. Starbucks started in the guy's garage. You know, Bezos, and that even though we're facing a challenging time, now's the time to dream about what's going to be your future, our future, 1 year from now, 2, 3, 5 years from now, because it can be extremely exciting and motivating.
When we think about the workforce of the future too, you know, that may be shifting with all of this. And that's another reason to tune in to what businesses are saying. Pay attention. Next slide. Okay, so we are going to spend about 5 minutes talking with you about the book study. And Dana, will you kind of keep track of what's happening on the chat line to see if we need to open it up for people? So what we're going to do is give you 3 webinars, the Leader's Guide. You'll get a new guide after each session, or actually after this session, after the second, and right before the third. And then we encourage you to get the book because it goes with the guide and what we're saying. Everything we're saying is really tailored with COVID-19 in mind. Next slide. So we had an 8-step process that we've used with visioning. And in the book, we spend a chapter or 2 on 2 or 3 of these. So we have steps 1 through 4, steps 5 through 8. And what we are going to ask you to try to do is between now and when we meet again in a few weeks, is to go through step 1, 2, and 3, perhaps, if you can get there. It's kind of fascinating because when we developed the book, we said, you know, there are 2 ways of looking at visioning. There is this real systematic way that we really like, where you give yourself time and you research things and you have time for reflection and you get a small group of people together to meet with you and you kind of bounce ideas back and forth and then you expand your group. And then Paul said, well, you know what? He had a time when he had the vision during a crisis. And Paul, do you want to spend a minute talking about what that's like?
So in my 10 years as superintendent, the first 5 began with some challenges, both on the budgeting side as well as loss of life. 6 students took their lives by suicide, and it appeared that there was the potential for contagion. So we began visioning what the future would look like with no suicide, with kids being happy and healthy, mentally well. And that was a very, very difficult time for our community. A lot of finger pointing, a lot of threats, very discouraging. But we visioned through it. We identified what we believed the future of our community should look like and began to build strategies around that vision. And the good news is there have not been any suicides for the better part of 19 years in that community.
No, I just saw a response on the chat line that, it's really hard to think about this visioning right now with everything that's going on. And I have to say, I get that. I totally do. But I also know that we are bouncing ideas around with each other. Even if we're not going the deep dive into understanding visioning right now, there are these conversations that come up. And I think that can inform and be part of your visioning process. Missy, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, don't make it more than it needs to be. Everybody has their own situation right now. But just the fact that you're here, you're listening, you're thinking, you're going to move forward this week and continue to think about that. And you can think about, who are my go-to? Who are the people that are the sharers and influencers on my team, or that I need to make sure I'm hearing their voice, because possibly there are people that I don't always access or get their information from. Start thinking about just the skeleton. Don't make it into a huge task. The key is that you're reflecting on the concept of collaboration and including voice to form what your belief system is for what can this be and what drives what's important to us.
In addition, identify your biggest critics and include one or more in this group, because they can provide you incredible feedback that will help frame the success of your vision going forward.
Yep, I love that. Yep.
I have to say, when I've done it, I've probably started with those people that are kind of in my corner and got their impressions and learned from them, but fairly quickly then went out and expanded the group. But I wanted to have a little firmer base before I went way out on my limb. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide. So Missy, do you want to talk about some of the things that people can go through as they vision with us?
Yeah. So as you start to glance through some of the reflective activities and different pieces that are included in the materials, I think it gives you permission to think outside of your current knowledge. The information will charge you to consider, as Paul just said, consider that opposite side. Everybody's showing up to the table, especially in education, with a goal, similar goals. We want the best for kids. We want to have outstanding systems and products. So if you're hearing things that aren't in your wheelhouse, why? And not that it's wrong, but does it need to be tweaked, or is there a piece of that needs to be grabbed? And what these exercises are what will help you grow from just something that's inside your own spectrum to a collaborative approach that many people can buy into.
And I might just say, if you look at that key learning #1 on visionaries, that was kind of a fun thing to do. And even during this time, give yourself permission to reflect a little bit, maybe be a little nostalgic even, in terms of, like, in the past, looking back backwards. Who are the visionaries that stand out in your mind? And what did they do? Think of Martin Luther King, right? What made him so great? And what was his leadership like? And what are the lessons for us? To me, I think part of it is courage, courage, and also being able to articulate the vision in a way that motivates people, that helps make things vivid and real, and helps us to dream. And we need that today. So I encourage you to do that as part of your work, frankly. Okay, part of what we do, and this is like step 4, I think, we ask you as you formulate your vision, go back and research exemplars and to think about who's doing it, where else is this happening, what can I learn from others? And Paul, you had some good examples of what you're doing and how you're looking at what's going on elsewhere and how that's informing your vision.
So as many school leaders and teachers, administrators across the country are concerned, they're concerned about opening school again in the fall. They're concerned about size and spacing of classrooms, some larger, newer construction, older buildings that wouldn't fit 30 people with 6-foot spacing, transportation issues, and then charters and online assessment. In Michigan, K-12 online has been marketing, they've probably spent several $1 million marketing to keep kids in their program. There's that concern. Then there's the formative assessment, summative assessment, teaching from a distance, learning at a distance. And then we have a little focus on teacher and principal self-care, which we have to get back to. And that's what we're working on now as an association. At our Department of Education, as I said earlier, we're launching a summer guidance document that identifies how to extend learning through the summer to help better equip kids to start school in the fall. We're working with our Department of Education, identifying 3 principles from urban, rural, and suburban spaces to help plan for the fall, that startup. And there's likely to be a plan of A, B, and C. It could be all face-to-face, it could be a blended model, or it could be all online. And again, we have to be prepared for that flexibility, because if the COVID-19 numbers increase in a community, that particular school or district or community might have to go to all online. Many different plans and practicing and preparing for the start in the fall.
So Paul, do you want to say something?
Sort of the crisis response.
Yeah. Paul, do you want to say something about South Korea too?
So we are staying well connected with South Korea. My middle son is the Inspector General for South Korea, and they've done a remarkable job of dealing with COVID-19. They're an exemplar, in my estimation, in that they do a remarkable job with testing first, with distancing. Schools are still closed. The extension has occurred again. They were down to 0 cases. A foreigner flew into Seoul, contaminated 3 or 4 bars, and then went on to contaminate some other spaces. So they ended up with 33 cases, 33 people that were exposed. And so my point, though, is that they have contact tracing and isolation and quarantining down to a science, to the extent that we need to follow their lead. For example, they're an exemplar for dealing with COVID-19, and they learned from the SARS and other epidemics that hit South Korea. To that end, in Michigan, there is a myth that COVID's not that big of a deal, and the truth is, since 2000, 2,200 people in Michigan died since the year 2000. We have more than that die in a single month from COVID. So we need to take it seriously and deal with fake news and bust the myths so we can get back to applying real science to treating the epidemic, so that we can get back to some semblance of what we used to call, or will call, normal face-to-face interaction.
Okay, I'm looking at the time. Let's move on. What we're going to do is we're going to wrap up in the next 3, 4, 5 minutes. And then the format we would like to use for the session, this session and others, is to formally wrap up by, say, 5 or 10 after the hours. And then if you want to hang on for another 15 or 20 minutes, Paul and Missy and I will stay. And if you wanted to go into separate rooms, Zoom rooms, we can do that starting with the next session, if you just tell us you'd like to do that ahead of time. But we know that some of you just wanted to listen and be here, and others may want to talk. So we want to give you those two options. Next slide. So Dana, you're on.
Yes. So as Chris mentioned, we also have a collaborative, the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative, which is a collection of schools and educators who are looking for best practices, evidence-based practices to address trauma in schools. And we have a resource that we've created on the Basecamp platform. It's a resource database that's organized via the topics that you see there, all related to trauma-informed education. And we do provide a variety of different resources, including curricula, webinars, articles, and also access to our team of researchers, which can answer questions and find resources about specific needs that your school has. So we do invite everyone on this webinar to join the CTLC Basecamp teams. If you would like to be a part of that resource, please make that indication in the chat box right now, and we will add you to our Basecamp, so you'll receive some resources.
I might say one of the things I love about Basecamp too is that things are archived there. So not only do you get immediately responses, probably within 24 hours, to questions, but then we have archived responses organized by topic areas. So our last poll of the night, what can we do to help? And it says best help. So if there's like one thing that stands out, go for it. And do we have answers yet, or is it too soon? Okay, not surprised. This is our way of telling you that we can do these things, that we will pay attention to you. And if you hang in there with us and let us know what's most important to you in the weeks to come, we will do our best to respond, and to respond with scientific information, with updated information from leaders, from diverse sources. I saw one comment on the chat box about how when we go out to diverse sources, sometimes we come up with new solutions, more creative solutions. I totally agree with that. And we'll do our best to support you in these ways. So our guide that's coming to you has these components. You'll get some excerpts from the book, as well as some questions related to COVID-19 and visioning. Okay, now I've given you a chance to think about your questions. If you feel like you need to hop off, thank you for being with us. We have more resources and support coming. But if you want to stay with us for 5, 10, 15 minutes, we'll now open the mics up. And Dana, you're our traffic cop here.
We did have one person who wanted to add a comment. So Sue Mullane, would you like to speak?
Of course. I wanted to just publicly acknowledge what our school nurses are doing in Anchorage regarding COVID and tracking. We've only have like 395 active cases, and one of them is my neighbor who lives 200 yards away from me. And she was non-symptomatic or asymptomatic. But the school nurses in Anchorage have been the core of the detective team for the state of Alaska. They've done a remarkable job. Granted, we have some advantages with respect to geography. But school nurses, historically speaking, are flexible. They can multitask. And as we think about trace and track, I also think about our vulnerable kids. CNN said today that child abuse reports are up 53% in the past 2.5 months. So when we think about trace and track, could we think about trace and track as a prevention measure for those children that we know are vulnerable in their homes? And what types of system support do we offer? Especially when we're talking about family systems therapy. What are the components that could be homogeneous for implementation from school to home? Parent training in a crisis, resilience building. So I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah. I want to say, Sue, thanks for those comments. I was just about a week ago on a call with one of your principals. His name's Doug Gray from Anchorage. And
Yeah.
Doug was explaining to our team, that national task force, some of the trials and supports that you guys have truly lost because of lack of your pilots and some different pieces that kids and communities really depend on up in our more rural areas like Alaska. So the fact that you're saying our school nurses are stepping up into that capacity, that's awesome.
They've been vital and they've been compassionate. Thank you. And we have private citizens that are actually doing food distribution because our ferry system is down with their own boats to make sure that communities don't starve. I mean, you talk about Maslow.
Yeah.
We're seeing it up close and personal.
It's fabulous.
Thanks for sharing, Sue. Good to hear your voice.
Good to see you, Paul. Thanks for sharing today.
So I want to go back for just a second and talk about families again and what more we can do. And I think one of the things is to recognize that families don't always know how to handle the stress. And they may need guidelines. And there are many resources out there. The National Association of School Psychologists is one example. There are many organizations that have guidelines that'll tell you things you can talk with parents about or to share with parents about how to talk with kids about COVID, for example, or what to do if they start to get upset, how they can recognize their own tension and stress. And so when we think about our heart-centered learning and mindfulness, how can we help parents increase their conscious awareness of what they're feeling and what to do with their thoughts and their feelings? Mm-hmm. And Dana, I see you nodding, and I know you work with parents. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I was just having a conversation this morning about this very topic and how we have kind of two buckets of parents right now. We have the parents who, as you all referred to earlier, have those healthy coping mechanisms. They have resiliency. And then we have the parents who they are overwhelmed and they are dealing with their own stress and they are not able to be those models of calm for their children. And the advice that we've been giving is put your oxygen mask on first. You really need to deal with your own stress and your own big emotions before you can be that model of calm for kids. So everything that you talk about in the Mindfulness Practices book and the Mindful School Communities book is kind of the foundation of getting back to that awareness of how our stress is affecting us and taking care of that before we can then really focus on making connection the most important thing. A lot of people, they say, oh, my child needs so much attention. They don't want your attention, they want your connection. And so if we can just focus on the positive and try to find those moments where we're able to look into each other's eyes, which really helps with attunement, giving eye contact and really actively listening and trying to hear their voice rather than interrupt and say what you think they're saying, can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I will just say that, part of my vision is that relationships between parents and children will improve, that they are improving. I'll put this in positive, affirmative tones right now. We are seeing better relationships. Children are feeling more connected to families, and that will continue to improve. I think that has to be.
Office or your leadership without hesitation. Number 3, seek to understand others. Hear every idea, propose solution, and fix. Use what works for your context. Number 4, thank and praise your teachers, bus drivers, paras, cooks, and custodians. Anyone that you're working with directly. They're remarkable. Assure them that they will be okay. And number 5, remind everyone that this incredibly challenging time is temporary. We'll get through it together. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Oh, actually, we have a couple more quick announcements. Sorry. We just wanted to make sure that you knew that our funding does come from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which does require us to evaluate our services. So attendees that provided their email address will receive an evaluation survey about 24 hours after the close of the event, along with the slideshow and a link to request CEU credits or participation certificates. We really do appreciate your honest and anonymous feedback, which helps give information to SAMHSA and assist us in planning future meetings and programs. We hope that you make plans to participate in upcoming online childhood trauma learning collaborative events, including the next 2 sessions of this series, as well as a webinar on May 26th about courageous conversations with the manager of the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, Maria Restrepo Toro, and a webinar on June 16th about trauma-informed yoga in schools with me. So thank you again for everyone for attending. Please contact us if you have any questions whatsoever. And especially if you're in New England, please contact us if you're interested in becoming a part of our Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative.
Thank you. Take care.